a point in my life when I said, I can no longer ignore my heart. I said, if I don't do it now, I'll never do it, because life happens.
Welcome to the Crossing It Off podcast, where each episode we share the stories of individuals that are living out their bucket/life goal lists. I am your host, Roger Williams, and through hearing our guests' adventures, my goal is that you will find encouragement and empowerment to add and cross items off of your list. Welcome to the show, everybody. I am so excited. Our guest today is Helen Hossley, and she is an author, adventurer, downhill skier, and former National Park Ranger. Helen, thank you so much for being on the show.
You're welcome, Roger. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to talk with you.
Awesome. I think that my listeners are going to be excited to hear your story. So tell us, what was the thing that you crossed off your list?
What I crossed off my list was zigzagging down the Rocky Mountains from Banff, Canada to Taos, New Mexico.
Well, okay. So let's just go into some detail. When did this happen? When did you take this trip?
I took this trip in the late fall of 1989 through the spring of 1990. So
okay.
A few years ago.
A few years ago. So did you live in that area, or how did you?
No, I'm from the Adirondacks of New York,
Okay.
And I had relatives that lived in Colorado Springs. And when I was 8 years old, I took a trip with my great aunt. And I saw these big, beautiful mountains, and they made an impression on me. And I said, I just need to, and I never ever skied in my life. I was 8 years old, so I didn't grow up skiing, but I taught myself how to ski as an adult. And so I said, I want to ski every area that I've ever read about or dreamed about in the Rocky Mountains. And I did.
So 7 month long. Did you do this by yourself, or were you with somebody else?
No, I met up with, I was introduced to another woman. Her name is Ginger, and through a mutual friend of ours. And so when I met Ginger in the spring of 1989, I said, hey, I was thinking of taking this trip, and I can go by myself, but it would be nice to have company.
Sure.
And she said, sure. So we weren't in any career jobs. I was a waitress at a very fine French restaurant in Washington, D.C. at the time. And she was, I think she was an aerobics instructor or something. And so we said, okay, let's plan to save our money, and we'll start out in the fall of this year in time for the ski season. And so we started I picked her up in Highland Falls, New York, and we started heading west and stayed with friends mostly along the way. Wow. We were just saying, we're just going out, we're going to do the skiing thing.
So you had taught yourself how to ski. And as a little girl, the trip that you took to Colorado, was that a driving trip, or did you fly?
I flew. It was my first time ever in an airplane. Yeah.
All right. So I remember the first time I saw the Rockies out of a car window, and I was just, because it kind of just pops up at you, and they're like there, and it's just like, wow, those are very majestic. So you're living on the East Coast. There's decent skiing on the East Coast. Mm-hmm. Why did you pick the Rockies?
I don't know. I think it was more of a fantasy of, a life that, and the allure of out west, go sure. West, young person or young man, really, but I'm thinking of go west. And, we had some fantastic ski areas. I mean, I grew up near Lake Placid, so I learned to ski on that mountain,
right.
So the Olympic mountain, and a lot of great areas in Vermont as well. But I thought it would be fun and interesting and different than the East. Sure. And the few times that I went skiing in college, so this was after I was out of college, but when I was in college, I did do a few trips to the West, and the skiing is just magnificent.
And so you said you started up in Vancouver.
We started, interestingly enough, when we were heading across country, we said, okay, we started on a little hill in Wisconsin, and I can't even tell you the name of it, because we said, okay, if we're going to ski, we got to get our legs underneath us. And then our first mountain, Rocky Mountain, was in Red Lodge, Montana, at the mountain. So it's, just east of, I think, Yellowstone.
Okay.
And then Ginger had a friend from the Army, and he ran an overnight cross-country ski expedition in Yellowstone National Park. His name is Arden. And we stayed with Arden, and Arden needed help with, he had a group of 12 people that came in. And at the time, he still runs Yellowstone Expeditions, by the way, that does overnight cross-country skiing in Yellowstone. He was having that over Christmas break. There were people coming in, but in the meantime, Ginger and I skied Big Sky. We went up, all the way up to Canada into Calgary. Okay. And I read about Banff, and I said, oh my gosh, I just have to ski in Banff. So we stayed at youth hostels, at a youth hostel there, and we downhill skied and in Banff. I don't remember the mountain, but it was magnificent. And we also went cross country skiing about, I think it was 40 kilometers north of Banff at a little place called Mosquito Creek. And it was isolated. It was a cabin. It had no running water, and it had a wood heated sauna. And we'd go to the brook and break the ice and get the water for our morning coffee and food. And we picked up a young woman. Her name is Wendy. She was traveling around the world by herself. She was from Australia. So we adopted her for about a month to have her come back into the States with us and continue skiing. And it was great. I don't know how we fit her in my car, but we did.
So I'm really interested, and we were talking about this earlier before we started recording. I'm so interested in how you accomplished this goal from a standpoint that there was no Google, there was no Travelocity, there was no booking.com. So how did you plan the trip? Was it just like, we're just going and whatever happens, or how did that all work as far as, even having roadmaps, I guess,
Yeah, well, we did. We had roadmaps, and well, from March of 1989 through November, when I picked Ginger up, we would call on a weekly basis, and we'd say, okay, first we would check in to make sure that we were making enough money, because we had this idea that we'd had to have X number of dollars because we weren't going to be working. And so we would check on that and saying, oh, yep, I'm on track with savings. Okay. And then, okay, what areas that where do you want to ski? So we kind of meshed together our list, if you will. And then we started mapping out, okay, who do we know across country that we could stay with? And it turned out that between the two of us, we had friends all the way across the country until we got to Red Lodge, Montana. And we took the northern route. We went up, went through Buffalo, stayed with a friend there, went through Kentucky, stayed with a friend there, Indianapolis, then we went up to Chicago. We did stay at a youth hostel in Chicago. We didn't know anybody in Chicago, but we knew somebody in Wisconsin. And then we knew someone in St. Paul, Minneapolis. And then we got to Red Lodge, and we stayed in a hotel that was similar to a youth hostel. And then once we skied at the big mountain in Red Lodge, we hopped over to Yellowstone, and that's where we stayed with Arden I stayed with him for, I think, a couple of weeks at least in Yellowstone, and helped him with his, Ginger flew to Washington State to be with her boyfriend. And and then I stayed with Arden, and I helped I was in Yellowstone with 12 other people by ourselves for a week in Yellowstone National Park. It was incredible.
So across the 7 months, how many different ski resorts did you ski at, or how many mountains did you ski on?
Oh my gosh, let's see. Banff, and we went up to I came back down, met Ginger again in Yellowstone. We went up to Red Lodge, not Red Lodge. We went up to oh my gosh, it's on the western part of Glacier National Park. That's another place where we skied, did some cross country skiing, and I'll think of the name in a minute. But so I think probably, I don't know, 14 or 15 perhaps.
Over the course of 7 months. That's still a lot.
Over the 7 months.
That's still a lot. What was your favorite mountain to ski with during this trip?
Oh my gosh. the one in Montana that I can't think of the name of right now.
Uh-huh.
uh, Boy, it's interesting how your mind doesn't, that thinks of things. And Taos, New Mexico was really quite fun because it was spring skiing. We
Right.
had our t-shirts on, and the weather was just perfect, and they had, so that, and Durango, believe it or not, Durango was a very fun place to ski as well. The town itself, it's the old Western town feel, and yeah. The
Well,
other place that I was surprised that I wasn't all that excited about, on the converse side, was in Utah. Although it was beautiful skiing,
right.
it was I wasn't. It was like, okay, it was just another mountain. But some of the other mountain towns that are not so commercialized was what I enjoyed the most.
Yeah, especially back in the 80s, probably not as developed as they would be today.
Yes, yeah, that's
Yeah.
true.
What's the what was the hardest thing about the trip in general? Not just like skiing or something, but like what actually, like taking the trip, what was like the hardest thing that you had to figure out or accomplish while you were doing this?
I think the hardest thing was not spending all of our money at once. Budgeting our money to make sure that it would last, through the trip. And it's interesting because Ginger and I didn't know each other. We
Right.
were introduced by a mutual friend, as I said, and so there was the risk there of, here you're going to commit to be traveling for at least, the winter season with someone you barely ever knew. and
Right.
and I thought that would be hard, but we were so well matched. And Ginger and I have been, buddies and best friends even now. I mean, we have, children the same age, and I'm going to go to a daughter's wedding in June. So I
Nice.
have a lifelong friend with Ginger.
Is
Yeah,
there
so
s-
budgeting the money, and then and picking the places that we really wanted to ski, that was kind of a tough decision because you only have a finite period of time, and
right.
then you also have to deal with the weather. It's like, can you get to the place where you want to ski?
Yeah, and there's still going to be snow or decent snow to ski on for sure. Was there something that you and Ginger did, Helen, like in the car or while you were together, that kind of helped solidify those bonds, or was it just natural, or did you play some kind of games, or what were those first couple of days like as you were getting to know each other?
Yeah. Well, one of the things I remember about Ginger is that she brought her knitting with her,
Mm,
and the only other person I knew that knitted was my mother, and then older women in the community that I grew up in. So to have a young person knit, and she was knitting a sweater. It wasn't like she was just knitting a scarf.
oh
She
yeah.
was knitting a sweater for her brother. And so I would ask her questions about knitting, but we talked about each other's lives the
Mm,
first few days, and staying with friends and family members across the country helped because you got to see different pieces of each other from their perspective,
interesting. Yeah.
and that really helped. Yeah.
That's really interesting. I recently did the Camino de Santiago, which is a 790-kilometer trek across Spain, and um, I have lots of friends that I got to know during that trip, and now I'm taking this trip through Europe and re-seeing a lot of people, and it's so interesting just being in real clothes, not your hiking clothes or stinky, just smelling because you walked 50 miles that day. It's very
Yeah.
interesting to see people in that real world context, outside of the Camino. So I get that a little bit. What was like one of the major stories, like the fun stories, the something that like happened along the trip that you're like, oh my gosh, I tell this story all the time because it's so good. What's that one story?
Once it got too warm for us to ski, we kept the skis on top of the car, and we started hiking in the national parks out west.
Mm,
Okay. And so the trip was always planned for me to drop Ginger in LA because she had a job waiting for her. She had a college friend. They had a job lined up. I didn't have a job. I didn't know what I was going to do after that. But when we, it was right outside of Taos, it was a state park that we were hiking in. And when we got to the trailhead, there was a state park ranger that said, you just want to be careful. We saw some evidence of cougars in the area. So, just be mindful. They usually don't bother you, but be careful. And we said, okay, thank you. And so we hiked in along this riverbed, and we were intending on spending the night, which we did. So we pitched a tent and had dinner of our famous tuna noodle casseroles that we always brought with us.
Cat food, no.
My mother's like, oh, never, but it was so delicious after hiking 10 miles that day, right? So
yeah, I imagine.
Good. And it's easy to cook. And so throughout the night, though, I heard some wrestling outside of the tent, and I was too chicken to actually go out and see what that possibly could be. And then the next morning during breakfast, I said, Ginger, did you hear all that noise outside the tent? She says, yes. And I didn't want to, wake you up, but I was hopeful that if it was a cougar, that it'd eat you first.
That's a good friend right there.
I'm like, yeah, thanks, Ginger.
Most definitely. If somebody else wanted to do this today and came to you and said, hey, Helen, I heard your story. What's like the one thing you would let them know? What was the one thing that you would say, oh, you've got to do this, or make sure that you're prepared for X, Y, or Z? What would that thing be?
I appreciate you asking that question as I look at, it was well over 30 years ago, right, that I did this trek, and travel is completely different today, because you have, your handheld computer that can bring you anywhere. And I'd say if you're going to do this trip, don't stick too much to a schedule. Trust your gut feeling and your intuition, and let that lead you to where your next spot is going to be, because it's usually always it is always right on, and there's something serendipitous that happens out of that you never really planned.
So let me ask you this. Even in today's standards, doing a trip like this, there would be could be some hesitation for a young woman to do this on her own, or even with another friend. What was it about you and Ginger? What are the characteristics that you had back then in the 80s, right? That made it possible for you to have the courage to do this kind of trip and be this adventurous back then? What was that? What was in you that said, okay, let's go for it?
I was at a point in my life, I managed restaurants for Marriott Corporation. I had a degree in resort management, and I got really tired of working 80-hour work weeks. And it was at a point in my life when I said, I can no longer ignore my heart. I said, if I don't do it now, I'll never do it. Because life happens, right? And you get into things. And I think that, along with a little bit of being naive about the world as well,
Explain that a little bit. Explain that a little bit.
Well, we stayed with, I think it was in Indianapolis, and we stayed with Ginger's brother and sister-in-law, and we were out to dinner, and the sister-in-law says, well, do you have a gun? Like, no, why would we even think of carrying a gun? It never occurred to us that there could be any type of danger out there. Right. And whereas I think today we're so bombarded with what's dangerous that we don't trust that there's more good in the world. And there is.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I was in Thailand with some people traveling, and we were in our hotel. We got in really late, and we were looking out the balcony and down the street, and just all these people were like funneling into these side alleys, And one of my friends like, let's go down there and see what's going on. And we're like, okay. And it's not like there was anything like threatening about what we were doing or where we were at, but it was just like you kind of knew, yeah, we probably shouldn't be here, but we'll be okay. And it is that naivete that you just go out and do, and if you, like you said earlier, the universe provides in some ways, and you just have to be willing to be open and accept that. So what was the one thing after you were done with the trip? Like what was the one mindset that you walked away with after doing that? How did it impact your worldview and
Mm.
where you were going in life?
I mentioned earlier that I didn't have a job waiting for me,
Mhm.
like Ginger did. But when I was in Yellowstone in January of 1990, and Arden not only had his own cross-country ski expedition in the winter, he was a national park ranger. He was a geologist by training.
Mm.
And so he would apply every year to be, and I knew very little. I mean, nothing. Yellowstone was my first national park. I heard of, the Grand Canyon, but, I'm an
Sure.
East Coast person. You don't really hear a lot about national parks. And especially living in the Adirondack Park, you
Right.
think that's that's a park. And so Arden said, here, I have an extra application. Why don't you fill it out? This was in January. And I said, well, okay, I don't have anything else to do. It was a 10-page application. No, it's not
Wow.
online, obviously. It's
Right.
a 10-page application. And, the application was not only, all your, who are you, date of birth, that type of thing, but they had questions. And the questions range from how well you operate a chainsaw to how well you work with public and, what makes you qualified to be a ranger. And on a scale of 1 to 5, anything over a 3, you had to substantiate with either education or work experience.
Okay.
And so I filled it out. It took me, I don't know, an hour or so to fill out this application, sent it in, didn't think anything of it. And it's like, okay. And then you only could pick 2 parks too, to say if
Oh,
you were
wow.
selected, where would you like to work? And I said to Arden, I said, I don't know, what park should I put down? And he says, well, everybody always wants to work in the big ones. They want to work in Yosemite and Yellowstone and Grand
Mhm.
Canyon and up at, Denali. So I said, all right, well, I don't know, Glen Canyon, that sounds kind of interesting. And then I also put down Sequoia Kings Canyon, one in California and one in northern Arizona. And he says, yeah, that's pretty good. The desert's a neat place to be. It'd be kind of hot in the summer, blah, blah, blah. Didn't think anything of it. And April rolls around and I call home, right? And find a payphone because there's no cell phones.
What's a payphone again?
What's a payphone again, right? And I was just calling in to check in with my parents and saying, oh, this is where we are now. And I think I was in New Mexico, and my mother says, oh, there's this man, his name is Dan Hand, and he wants to give you a job. I'm like, what? I'm skiing. What do you mean he wants to give me a job? And I completely forgot about this
Oh,
application.
geez. Yeah.
And apparently the scoring system, however they worked it at the Office of Personnel Management, my application rose to the top. And I called Dan the next day. I said, oh, I understand you trying to reach me. And he says, yes, I want to offer you a job as a national park ranger. And I said, well, tell me a little bit more about this job. My only other experience is not only Yellowstone, but then at this time we visited Mesa Verde, and I saw a couple of rangers, and there was a woman ranger actually at Mesa Verde. I thought that was interesting. And so he told me, he says, well, you'd be working mostly at the visitor center, and it's mostly telling people about where to find the bathroom or how far it is from one point to another, or the Grand Canyon or whatever. He says, but you will be doing campfire programs as well. So you're an interpretive ranger. I said, okay, I have 2 questions. He said, okay. I said, the first one is, do I have to deal with anything about food or restaurants? I was so over being in restaurants. He says, no, not at all. I said, okay, great. I said, well, this is the deal breaker question. And he said, okay, what is that? I said, well, do I get to wear one of those neat hats?
There you go.
And he said, you absolutely do. You get to own one.
Nice.
And then that's actually the title of my book as well. Do I get to wear that neat hat?
Do you still have the hat?
Oh yeah, I have 2 of them. I have a summer and a winter hat.
Nice.
And so that began my career as a Park Service as a national park ranger. And if you asked me what was the most important thing that I took away from, is not only being out in nature and skiing and experiencing it at the level I did, but then being a ranger and taking the oath to preserve and protect for future generations. I took away the sacredness of our world and the environment. And also being a park ranger led me to Washington, D.C., where I met my husband. He came to be a ranger.
Nice.
On the mall. And so we've been married 30 years and we have 2 children. And so we have 4 hats.
You have 4 hats. And I'm sure that the one day you'll have grandchildren and they'll want to wear those hats.
They want to wear those hats. Yeah, that's right. Right now they decorate my wall.
So Helen, tell me, what's the next thing on your list that you would like to cross off?
Next thing on my list is to do something similar, but in Europe, not necessarily ski. I think my downhill skiing days are over. I still cross country ski. But I would like to really experience the world in Europe. That's on my list. And
just, you don't have any exact plans. You just know that you want to take some time and live inside Europe.
Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. And plan it with Ginger, because we still have
nice.
Plans.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Well, I thank you so much for sharing your story. I know it's going to inspire people, and I think that's awesome. Can you let us know right now, like, where people can find you on the internet, or more information, especially about your book?
Yes, I have a website called helenhossley.com, and it's HelenHossley.com. And it's the story of where you can buy my book and see a little bit more about my story. And I'm also on Facebook and LinkedIn as well, under my name.
We will put all those links in the show notes so that people can get to them really easily. Helen, thank you so much for being here. I appreciate you telling your story, and the bravery that it took for you and Ginger to go out and make this trip happen, I think is awesome. And I hope you
You're welcome, Roger. It's really been a pleasure going down memory lane with you.
As a reminder to our listeners, in this episode's show notes, you will find links to learn more about this week's guest and information on how you can cross this item off of your list. You can follow my adventures of crossing items off my bucket list on Instagram and Facebook. And as always, new episodes of this podcast are available to stream every Friday morning. We will meet you here next week. And until then, keep living out your list.